Hello and welcome to this video on why a worrying number of products carry this unnecessary and unwarranted warning about cancer risks. As with many things in the world that cause trouble, we can squarely and fairly blame California. And not for the same reasons we blame Florida and sunshine laws for Florida man, but instead the asinine and inane laws that California makes that find their way to being inflicted on other people, with nothing to do with California. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with California's feces-filled streets and use syringe problem, so it's a small silver lining that we can find. If you buy food, goods, accommodation, drinks, and all kinds of other things, you have a good chance of finding one of these stickers or a variation on it somewhere. The sticker, ticket, or similar all exists because of California, and the various and often very niche laws it makes. It is an example of how one small part of the world can change everything else, just like how Japan has introduced anime, Liechtenstein for false teeth, or we have Britain for turning otherwise edible food into a congealed mess of marginally edible food. Slightly better than Scotland, where they make haggis, which, although described as food, certainly shouldn't be considered such. In terms of cancer in California, or the hot dog of this video, it is the result of a 1986 event called the Proposition 65. It was a ballot initiative that, theoretically, fielded a simple problem. Can we protect safe water and enforce laws on toxic materials? The answer to this in a vote of 63 to 37 was yes, we can. It's important to note that a ballot initiative is slightly different to a regular piece of law. A ballot initiative is something where the public brings enough signatures in a petition to the government to put into effect a law that they want to be implemented. Generally speaking, this law is written already by the people making the application for it. The basic premise of Proposition 65 is good. Safe water is good for everyone, as water is almost everywhere and in every part of life. Whether it is drinking water, food, showering, washing dishes, and so on, its goals are to protect drinking water sources from toxic substances, mostly those that are either going to cause cancer or birth defects, and where and when possible, reduce or eliminate exposure to these chemicals in broader terms. It's this latter part which is why we see it so often, and it is essentially the source of all of our grief. The Act itself states, "No person in the course of doing business shall knowingly discharge or release a chemical known to the state to cause cancer or reproductive toxicity into water, or into anywhere that feeds a drinking water source. No person in the course of doing business shall knowingly and intentionally expose anyone to those chemicals without first giving clear and reasonable warning." Hence this stupid ticket. To see it in practice, we come back to that same silly sticker time and time again. The following warning language is more or less standard and pretty much found everywhere, although again variations do exist, but if it's sold in California, it's probably going to have this. A warning that this product contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer and birth defects or other reproductive harm. Yeah, we have concerns about that language, but we can start with one simple issue here, and the whole underlying problem with Proposition 65 is that although there is a long and extensive list, the amount, and certainly the exposure, of any of these things that are on that list is never defined. And so they've warned you about something without giving any idea about actual safe doses or limits. California. We'd make a joke about dreaming or hotels, but perhaps not. This brings us to the actual list of banned or prohibited chemicals. No, don't worry, we aren't going to read it to you, not just because there are more than 870 listed chemicals, but most are very opaquely named for the average person, so even if we were to read it to you, it wouldn't be much help. So we have been rather hard on proposition that seems like it really doesn't do any harm and has a very good reason to exist. The problem we have with it is, beyond it being silly, threefold: the lack of efficacy in implementation, the abuse of the process, and the poor basis for some of the decisions that have been made to schedule chemicals. To start with the lack of efficacy in implementation, to use a simple example, petrol or gasoline is a scheduled item that needs to carry the warning as it contains a wide range of carcinogens. Although it does that, it has not had any effect on people buying and using fuel, and so the warning is of no value. Nothing changed, and it added legal hurdles, bureaucratic burden, and more to something that didn't really need it. Next we have the abusive process, both for and against Proposition 65. There are law firms, let's call them, that specialize in issuing at random and somewhat spurious proceedings against the law. They get paid by the applicant and really do very little useful work. This ties up already limited judicial time and resources. Time and resources that could be better used doing something actually productive. On the other side, we have litigation based on this law itself. Specifically, those stickers. There are a variety of critics, both at a corporate level and at an industry level, that basically have to keep fighting battles around them having these labels on them, and the fact that various litigants are using the mechanisms under Proposition 65 to either make them defend themselves without reason, to try and claim that there are associations there just aren't, or that the businesses, industry, corporations and so on are causing things that they actually have no relationship to. For example, the seafood retailers and the fact that some of them contain mercury, which the seafood retailers have zero control over. When you actually look at what happens from these court cases, well, a lot of money is paid out each year. We're talking millions of dollars here each time, and nearly 3/4 of what gets paid out is paid to the attorneys, lawyers, whatever you wish to call them, that are involved in this. Meaning about 3/4 of the money never actually sees any benefit from a law that was intended to help protect people and the environment. On a, let's call it a larger scale, if we go back to the earliest period of this law coming into effect in 88, there have been about 30,000 claims made, affecting about 100,000 products. Now, that is not that big, all things considered. But what is important here is that in the last 20 years, about $400 million in settlements were made, and about $300 million of that went to the attorneys. So, even if we look at just the general trend here, it's really not a good figure here. It's basically lawyers making money out of bad law. And the reason why we call it bad law comes to the last part. That is, we have the scheduling of these chemicals. Now we should be clear that not all items listed are wrong, but there is a notable section that raises questionable claims about the validity of how they have decided what does and doesn't get classified as carcinogenic. The leading example is using IARC, or the International Agency for Research on Cancer, as an authority. IARC specializes in establishing the possibility of things causing cancer, not the actual risk of it causing cancer. And to use a slightly easier analogy, it would be like if IARC was a lifeguard at the pool. Their job is to monitor the pool and rescue someone if something goes wrong. They assume there's going to be an accident, and not incorrectly so. By contrast, the people using the pool recognize that there is a risk. That means IARC has no role to play in the pool, and in many cases, well, with other carcinogens. They also recognize that the risk is low as the pool is a safe place with a little actual probability of something going wrong, even though a drowning can occur in theory. This is the problem with using IARC. They can tell you that something causes cancer, but not how much exposure is needed, for how long or in what manner. The same way a lifeguard is at the pool simply waiting for an event to occur. They can't tell you how long it'll be before someone drowns. In order to understand what actual, let's say, risk or hazard is presented by a carcinogen, you need another UN organization. This is the problem. California relies on the wrong agency to identify the need for a label without consideration of things like exposure route, dose, and so on. They're basically sitting there going, okay, this thing can cause cancer if you bathe in it for a year and you also happen to drink it religiously and so on. But nobody ever actually does that. By contrast, there could be something that only by a very small period of exposure, you get cancer, like radiation. Well, suddenly that's not going to be an issue. You can understand that pretty easily. Imagine, if you will, that the listed item is there because it causes cancer when you eat or drink it. You also find a warning label on something like paint or a ready-made object. So we know that this thing has that particular substance, say in the paint, or a finish on it. Well, you're not likely to eat or drink the paint or chew on the ready-made objects like a bicycle, power tool, or toaster. On that basis, you just don't have any risk of cancer and it won't cause cancer. But IARC says it does, so it gets added to the list. Finally, we have the lack of efficacy, or at least appreciable end result. The first thing to note is that Proposition 65 led to a huge change in an industrial production level. A lot of things were remade, reformulated, or altered to remove chemicals that Proposition 65 considered carcinogenic and therefore dangerous. Now, this is not necessarily bad, but it isn't always necessary. It also means, though, that certain manufacturers avoid the use of certain materials that may otherwise be better because they want to avoid putting the Proposition 65 label on their products. And the warning label is kind of a misnomer. It's a label, not necessarily a warning label. This also means that if you are a company that has, say, reformulated to meet the new requirements, you may now be required to reformulate again if the new things you're using end up being added to that Proposition 65 list again. So it's not like this is a one-stop solution. It's a continuously moving goalpost. Now, the end result in terms of people has been more promising. When you look at testing of things like blood, urine, sewage and similar, there have been reductions of the listed chemicals in these samples. And they have been true across America, so that's not a bad thing. And it sounds great, except we don't have an equivalent improvement in cancer rates. This is, though, a result of things like improved detection rates, long-term survival, and the fact that the changes in the composition of products do not really alter the most significant risk factors such as genetics, diet, lifestyle, and so on. So it's not like this is actually a solution in those terms. Finally, it's the actual label itself. It really doesn't have the value you think it might. For example, you go to Starbucks and you get coffee, you will see a warning that says coffee can cause cancer. If you buy a children's toy like a scooter or a bike or similar, there's a good chance that you'll find something that says it can cause cancer on it. So this is a problem. And there's a reason why you find these warnings even though they are obviously not necessary. If, and this is the big if here, a company's product contains a chemical on the list, they basically have to go back to the California authority and say, look, this is how and why, if you use this thing as intended, when intended, and for what it's intended for, you're not going to get cancer from this thing being in there. However, that then opens up all sorts of liability, and it's also a huge expense to do so. So most companies just simply recognize that it's cheaper, quicker, and easier to slap a label that says this may cause cancer in California on whatever they make, and call it a day. Now, this also means that any actual, serious, legitimate risk of cancer from it is, at best, wildly overstated, and at worst, is basically giving people false alarm and diluting any actual, real-world and significant impact of this for things that are real carcinogenic risks. This is why your random doodad, thingamajig, or widget has a label warning you it will cause cancer. A part of the time it is just companies doing it to be safe. They don't want to pay the cost of litigation. Sometimes it is down to overzealous and overreaching laws. In fact, that's quite often the reason. Sometimes it is just because of actual risk. And of course it is occasionally just California being California. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.